Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and as part of my ongoing coverage for Essential X-Men Volume 7, we are going to be talking about issue 219. So this particular issue came out in 1987, and it was written by Chris Claremont, and it was guest penciled by Bret Blevins and inked by Dan Green. And the title of the issue is Where Duty Lies. Yep, Where Duty Lies. So this particular issue is noteworthy for a couple of reasons. So for one thing, this is the issue wherein the character of Alex Summers, aka Havok, returned to the team as a full-on member. And this is, considering the fact that he and his wife Lorna Dane, aka Polaris, had both been members of the original X-Men, but after their appearances in Giant Size, X-Men, wherein the new members of the team were introduced. I think it was in X-Men issue number 94, wherein all but Cyclops left the team, and it was basically just Cyclops and the new members of the X-Men plus Professor Xavier, and Jean Grey would come back, of course. But the rest of the original X-Men, including Alex Summers and Lorna Dane, had gone off to do their own thing. And so Alex Summers and Lorna Dane both returned to New Mexico to make a living as civilian geologists. And so they would both show up from time to time in stories written by Chris Claremont during his run on the X-Men, but it was just in guest roles. But this is the story wherein Havok would, make a return and become a full-fledged member of the team once more. And so this was the first time during Chris Claremont's run where Havok became a full-fledged member. So if you're a fan of the character of Havok, you definitely ought to check out this particular issue. And also, Chris Claremont as a writer does a wonderful job of getting into the mindset of the character, because he was already grappling with, say, personal insecurities and also some sibling rivalry with his brother, Scott Summers, aka Cyclops. And also he was grappling with his place in the world, because he was someone that, he was just wanting to live a normal life, but then found out he was a mutant, which in turn made him a target for all sorts of threats. And so, he basically, resented being a mutant, but he did the best he could under the circumstances. But when opportunity came for he and his wife to go away and try and make a living as, civilians, they took it. So, but circumstances arise which force him back into the fold. So, another reason this particular story stands out is because of the guest pencils by Bret Blevins. And so Bret Blevins is an artist who's particularly skilled in illustrating stories that have a horror element to them. And in fact, my introduction to the work was in a Batman series called Shadow of the Bat. And it was a 3-part storyline called God of Fear, which was a terrifying story which focused on the Scarecrow. And it was during, it was during Nightfall, that particular storyline. It was after Bane had broke Batman's back and Jean-Paul Valley, aka Azrael, was, taking Batman's place. And so, and Anarchy, the character Anarchy guest starred as well. But that was my introduction to Bret Blevins' work, and it was pretty scary. So, and it wasn't until later on that, I'd learned that he had also illustrated a Marvel Comics adaptation of the movie Krull, which is one of my favorite fantasy movies from the 80s. But his work on that particular adaptation was pretty good as well. But to be fair, he probably had a lot of photographic references, to work with. And so he was definitely capable of working in more than one genre. He could do horror, and he could also do fantasy. But a lot of people recognize him because of his lengthy tenure on the title New Mutants. And so, while, he is recognizable for that, in my opinion, that particular run wasn't his best, because the New Mutants as a book had a certain narrative style that, in my opinion, Bret Blevins' artwork wasn't really suited for. I mean, a couple of stories here and there would be one thing, but him as a regular artist, not so much. And so, while a lot of people, certainly, recognize his name from the New Mutants, I just think that there's better examples of his work. I mean, Batman Shadow of the Bat being one of them. But one of my personal favorite works of his was when he illustrated, the majority of the first 16 issues of the series Sleepwalker. And if you get a chance, definitely check that series out. It was, in my opinion, one of the better, Marvel Comics titles from the 90s. And the series was, in my opinion, at its best during the first 16 issues, which Bret Blevins illustrated the majority of. So, and while that particular series was more, sci-fi than horror, it definitely had some horror elements to them, which basically, was right up Bret Blevins' alley. So, but yeah. So in my opinion, those are the reasons that the story are that this particular issue is noteworthy within the Chris Claremont's run. And of course, we're still coming off of the heels of the Mutant Massacre, so there's still some fallout from that. But it starts off with Havok having this horrifying nightmare, wherein he comes from New Mexico, where he and his wife Lorna Dane are staying at, and where they're conducting their business as geologists. But he's come from New Mexico and back to New York to check on the X-Men, because in this nightmare he's having, he's tried to get in touch with them, but no one's answering the phone, and regardless of where he's calling from. And so he gets there and he finds the mansion deserted, and it looks like no one's been there in a while. And he finds Cerebro trashed, and he doesn't know what's happened. But then he opens a door and he finds the X-Men waiting for them, and amongst them is Magneto. And so a couple of the X-Men he recognizes, but only a couple of them. The rest he does not know who they are. And so when he sees Magneto amongst them, I mean, he goes into full-on paranoid mode, because he's like, what are they doing with Magneto? I mean, he's their deadliest foe. And so then in this nightmare they attack him, and their faces are all warped and everything, and Rogue actually latches onto him and kisses him, and he feels himself being stripped away physically and spiritually and mentally. And like his thoughts become a chaotic vortex wherein everything's running together, and he wakes up screaming, and he's become so terrified and so stressed that his power is building up. And his wife Lorna wakes up, and she's like, honey, what's wrong? But then she sees him lit up and glowing, and he charges out of the bedroom and out of the house before he blows it up. And so he just lets loose with this huge blast of energy, because his mutation allows him to absorb solar radiation and basically use it to he's able to absorb solar radiation and use it to discharge these energy blasts. But this particular episode, this particular nightmare, has got him so traumatized that it just built up like crazy, and he has to let it go. And so he fires off into the night sky, noting to himself that they'll probably see it in 3 other continents, because of how bright it is. And in fact, I mean, the blast was not only so bright, but it was so hot though that it fused the ground to glass below him. And so Lorna comes up to him and gets him out of there, or gets him off the spot where the ground's now glass, and brings him into the house. Puts a blanket on him. Tries to sort of comfort him. Make him some hot cocoa and some chicken soup. And she's using her magnetism to get all the stuff done. All the utensils and everything are just floating in the air. And basically the chicken soup is making itself, and so is the hot cocoa. And Havok's thinking to himself that, usually this entertains him, but now it just, scares him. And so he's, telling, Lorna, about the nightmare. And she's, confused because she's saying that, when you went to New York to see them, you said everything was fine. And you said that, they were all happy to see you and everything. And you came home and you said everything was okay. And he's like, I mean, yeah, and I remember you telling me that, but something's wrong. I keep having this nightmare, but this is the worst it's been, and, it feels like something happened over there when I went to see them. Because, one thing I should mention is that, in the issue before this one, he and his wife had, found evidence that the Brood, this, terrifying and predatory alien race, had come to Earth. And the story kind of ended on a cliffhanger, wherein Havok was saying we need to warn the X-Men because if the Brood are here, then humanity could very well be in trouble. And so the implication is that he went to try and warn them or try and tell them or something, but somewhere along the way, something happened that made him forget about it. And so, because there's no mention of it in the story here. And so, he's, telling Lorna that he feels like something's wrong, something happened. And, plus, I mean, the nightmares have got him so worked up that, he's, grappling with his own insecurities, which, he had been able to keep at bay as of late, with Lorna by his side. But with everything that's been going on, just in the world in general, and just, I guess you could say, mutant kind in general, they're like with the government wanting to bring back the Sentinel program for one, and also him finding out that, Magneto, the X-Men's greatest foe, is now, the head of the school and the leader of the team. I mean, this is something that has really shaken him, or these things are, have really shaken him. And so, he's telling her that he has to go back to New York, to find out what happened and, confront the X-Men, and just say, something's wrong, what's going on here. And so Lorna, she of course, offers to go with him because, I mean, she was one of the X-Men too. And plus, I mean, Havok's her man, and she doesn't want him to go off alone, but he's just telling her that he's like, hey, look, I'm really sorry, but I got to do this by myself. This is something that I got to handle for myself, just, for his own, mental, sanity. And plus, he doesn't know if he's walking into anything, and he certainly doesn't want to endanger her. And so, Lorna, she reluctantly agrees, but she says, if you think I'm going to let you walk to the airport, you're wrong. And so, the two of them, they go into their Jeep, and she uses her magnetic powers to, take it to, to basically fly it, from their home to the nearest airport. And so, as that's happened, they're actually being watched from a distance by a couple of figures, which turn out to be members of the Marauders, the same group of evil mutants that were behind the mutant massacre. And so these particular mutants, as far as we could tell, are Sabretooth, Arclight, and Scalp Hunter. And so, they're, kind of arguing and discussing whether or not they should go ahead and attack them. But, Scalp Hunter is telling them, no, we let them go for now. Because, remember, the target's Lorna Dane, aka Polaris. And so, Havok is someone that, is basically a non-entity in this particular mission. And so, since, the two of them are clearly leaving, it stands to reason that, they'll be back. And plus, they've been, sort of, monitoring them, recording them and stuff like that. And so they know Lorna Dane's going to be coming back, and this will make it easier for them to take her out because she's their next target. Whereas if it's her and Havok, then, it'll make it more difficult to, kill her. And not to say that they don't think they can't kill Havok and Polaris by themselves, but, it'll definitely take longer and be more difficult. So, in the meantime, Havok, after Lorna drops Havok off at the airport, and Havok, arrives in New York, he finds out that Magneto is, let's see, give me a sec, sorry. Okay, so he arrives at the mansion, and much like the nightmare he had, he finds, it looks like, no one's been there in a while, and he finds, Cerebro destroyed, and he's looking around, and he says, I mean, this all looks familiar, but where is everyone? I mean, I know the New Mutants are supposed to be here too, but I've never even met them. And so he finds Magneto's schedule book, or his planner, and looks through it, and he finds, the Hellfire Club, listed as, and this was Magneto's diary, and he finds it laying around, and he finds the Hellfire Club listed as, the place to, go to on that particular day. And so he reaches out to the Hellfire Club and makes up an appointment. And so when he shows up there, he's attended to, and they're told that, Professor Xavier is waiting for him. At first he's confused, but then he remembers that Magneto had made a point to, form a civilian identity as Professor Charles Xavier's cousin. And so it's like also a professor, since he's, head of the school now. And so he, they just figured it was something that would work well for civilian authorities and what have you. So that way no one would, put two and two together that, Magneto, the former, evil master of magnetism, is the head of the school. And so it took him a sec to remember all that. But he follows the servant who brought him in and attended to him, and he comes into this room with Magneto and the White Queen. And so he's like, what's going on here? Where are the X-Men? And what are you doing, with the Hellfire Club? Because, even though he's, stayed out of the superheroing, gig, he, knows from conversations, with, say, his brother, that the Hellfire Club is bad news. But he does not know is that, the X-Men had recently joined forces with the Hellfire Club. Like, they made an alliance with the Hellfire Club out of necessity because of, the newfound, dangers that are threatening mutant kind. I mean, you not only had, the Marauders, but and whoever it is that's pulling their strings, but you also have, say, that futuristic Sentinel Nimrod, which nearly killed both teams, or both organizations, if you will. And you also have the aforementioned bit of, the government literally wanting to bring the Sentinels back. And so, of course, the Hellfire Club and the X-Men are both groups of mutants. And with all these threats, they're like, hey, we need to join forces. We need to put whatever shit we had aside and just work together. And so, basically, let's see. Yeah, Emma Frost, aka the White Queen, is explaining to Havok that, Magneto is now the Hellfire Club's, new White King. And Magneto is trying to explain all this to him. He's trying to explain that, hey, these are dangerous times, and this decision was made with, the agreement of all the X-Men. And he's, offering his hand to Havok, just saying, join us, we can work together. And Havok, basically turns him down cold, and, storms out of there, basically, accusing him of, taking, Professor Xavier's dream and spitting on it, but the fact that he's throwing in his lot with the Hellfire Club. And he's like, I don't know, what your plans are, but, but there's no way I'm blindly trusting you on this. And so he just storms out of there. And also, another reason he storms out as abruptly as he does is, he is aware that the White Queen is a telepath. And so while Professor Xavier had trained the X-Men, the original X-Men, to defend their minds against intrusive, telepaths, he knows that he himself is not, say, a telepath. And so he might be able to, guard his, thoughts on a surface level, but he's not going to be able to keep it up for long. And so that's another reason. I mean, along with his, disbelief and, anger about the whole situation. I mean, that's another reason that he hightails it out of there as quickly as he does. And so Magneto is, frustrated by the whole situation because he's saying that, yet again, we've had a moment where, my past as an evil man has come back to haunt me, even though I genuinely have reformed. And so, going from there, Havok, he goes around the city, trying to, find someone who can tell him, where the X-Men are, because, neither, Magneto nor the White Queen, divulged any information about the X-Men, basically just saying that it's not possible for them to, make contact with Alex right now. But, if he had a message for them, Magneto would gladly give it to them. And of course, Alex is like, I'm not trusting you with that. And so, he's going around, trying to find help. And so he first, goes a few blocks away, to find the Avengers, only to find their mansion's been destroyed. And according to a little footnote here in the story, that was in an issue of the Avengers' own series where they fought the Masters of Evil. And so, the Avengers' mansion is destroyed, and so they're not there, and he can't get any help from them. And so he remembers that some of the, X-Men, were. He remembers that, some of the X-Men, at one point had basically, been staying on Muir Island, and he remembered Moira McTaggart lived there, and so he got her information and called her number to see if she knows anything about the X-Men. But instead he gets Callisto, the leader of the Morlocks, and she's very testy with him, and he's asking her if she can at least tell him where his brother is, because he's thinking if anyone can set things straight, it's his brother. But she tells him to just look in the yellow pages and hangs up on him. And so he's like, what was all that about? And it turns out, he doesn't know that his own brother is in fact leading a team called X Factor, which is ironically made up of the original 5 X-Men. And he doesn't know that Jean Grey is back amongst the living, and he doesn't know that his brother Cyclops had basically run out on his wife Madeline Pryor and their son Nathan to try and be with Jean again. I mean, he doesn't know anything about that, and ironically, he's trying to figure out why Callisto was so hostile with him as soon as he mentioned his brother. And when after she had told him to look at the yellow pages, you look in the background, this bus is going by, with an advertisement for X Factor. So, just irony at its best. The truth goes by and he doesn't even know it. So in the meantime, though, he's trying to figure out, okay, where do I go from here? But then the action cuts back to New Mexico, and the Marauders have taken a shot at Lorna Dane, who had arrived back from the airport, taken Havok from to the airport, and so they destroy her house, or the house where her and Havok were living. And Sabretooth, he is able to pick up on her scent, and he's telling Scalp Hunter, who blew the house up, that hey, you missed, she's still alive. She's hurt, but she's alive. And so basically, he's overjoyed at this because, he likes to, hunt people down and kill them rather brutally. And so, he easily tracks Lorna Dane down, and she uses her magnetism, to, pick up this, iron-rich, rock, and that's, basically yay big, and try and crush Sabretooth with it. And while it hurts him, it doesn't crush him. And she also uses her magnetic powers to tap into the ore deposits in the area to make these makeshift restraints for him. And while she is able to hold him down for a little bit, Sabretooth is able to just through sheer willpower break out of the restraints. And he's taunting her, saying that if you were going to kill me, you're going to have to think about it. Me, I don't have to think about it. Killing comes to me as easily as breathing. And so she tries to use her magnetic powers to propel herself away from Sabretooth, because she's able to fly to a limited extent with her magnetic abilities, but Sabretooth slashes her leg and hurts her even more. So she was already hurt from the explosion, and now she's got a slashed leg. And then Scalp Hunter hits her with this energy weapon that is supposed to disable her. And so then we go back to New York, where Havok has decided to try and follow Magneto. And so he waits in the trees outside of the Hellfire Club, and he's got his uniform on. And thankfully it's weather resistant, because it's freezing cold in New York at this time. But he's actually able to do a pretty good job of tailing Magneto. He's keeping his distance and everything, but he follows him to this underground passage in a train station, and he finds this secret doorway that he saw Magneto go through. And unfortunately, though, he didn't take into account that there might not really be anything for him to grab onto or step down. So Magneto, you get the idea, just literally floated down after walking through the doorway. And Havok just barely is able to grab onto a handhold on a ladder just in time. But then when he realizes where he is, he's looking at the tunnels, and he realizes that these are the Morlock tunnels. And so he remembers his brother telling him about the Morlocks. But mind you, he hasn't been in touch with his brother in a while, and so he doesn't know anything about the mutant massacre. All he knows is that these tunnels belong to the Morlocks, but where are they? And also he's seeing evidence of a massive inferno that happened at some point. And he says I don't know, I have no way of knowing when this happened, but whoever was standing around is surely dead. A blast that hot. And so then he hears voices, and he follows them, and because he recognizes a couple of them. And sure enough, he finds Storm, Psylocke, Longshot, and Magneto all talking with one another. And it's a very serious conversation where they're talking about how dangerous things are right now. And so they're coming to a conclusion that the only way that the Marauders are going to stop hunting us is if the X-Men die. And hearing this, Havok's like, what the hell? And which is right when someone walks up on him, which turns out to be Rogue. And so he hits her with one of his blasts, but part of him is hoping that that blast hurt her, because he still remembers her from the dream, basically kissing him and absorbing him, and he remembers himself being ripped apart and everything, just from the nightmare. And so he tries to hightail it out of there, but which is when the action comes back to New Mexico, and Scalp Hunter and Arclight are having a far more difficult time of going after Polaris than they thought, which is when Sabretooth is hurled back at them from Polaris's magnetic powers. And at that point, Arclight is basically um, forced underground, like to the point where her head's still sticking out, but the rest of her body's underneath the ground. And Polaris has used her magnetic powers to basically, seal her body up and, keep her restrained to where she has no way of moving at all. Because Arclight's thinking to herself, if she had just a little bit of room, she could, create a shockwave that could free her, but now she can't even move. And Scalp Hunter is, trying to, get his weapons back together, but his own, combat systems are being turned against him and to restrain him. And so, they're finding out the hard way that Polaris is a lot more dangerous than they thought she was. And, Scalp Hunter had earlier observed that since she's injured, she's going to be a lot more difficult to take down. Not impossible, but more difficult. And so, yeah, you're finding out that's true. And then it cuts back to New York, where Havok is trying to, run out of the tunnels, and Magneto uses his powers to, get some of the pipes, in the sewer system to try and restrain Havok, and he uses his powers to just blast everything and start running again. And Dazzler, comes onto the scene, and she and Rogue were both nearby, but she comes and tries to hit Havok with a blast that'll stun him but not hurt him. And yet Havok is so on edge, and so basically he's his paranoia is going to full on overdrive, and plus you got the adrenaline and the instinct kicking in. And so he fires one of his blasts at her, and it's a killing blast, and it would have killed her, except Longshot, was in the right place at the right time and is able to, get her out of the way just in time. And so Havok just then kind of realizes what he nearly just did. And so, he's like, oh my God, I'm I came in here, trying to figure out, what the problem was, and now I'm the problem. And so that's when Psylocke, she connects with him telepathically and calls him out and says, what the hell are you doing? Are you trying to get us? Are you trying to kill us? And so around at that point, Havok just kind of says, okay, I'm stopping. And so he powers down, and, the X-Men, basically, tell him what's going on. And they explain to him that the reason he's having these nightmares apparently is because they had tried to remove his memories of meeting them, or at least the memories that might have put him in danger, because when he had gone to see them, but then they had erased some of his memories, to make him, say, less of a target to someone like the Marauders. And so, yeah, and at that point, Havok is like, why would you do that? I mean, I was one of you guys. Excuse me. And Psylocke is explaining that the fact that he was one of the original X-Men and had some considerable mental defenses, courtesy of Professor X's training, it made it very difficult for her to use her telepathic abilities to basically rewrite the memory they had of their meeting. And she's saying that the only way that we could override your memory now is if we killed you. Because if she tried to do the same trick twice, it would be too much for his mind. And so at that point, he's like, surely you're not gonna try and kill me. And at that point, Storm and Magneto both step in and say, no, we're not going to do that. I mean, obviously we're not going to kill our own, but at the same time, I mean, you are a target now, and so because you remember, because the memory is coming back and everything, the memory of you meeting us is coming back. I mean, this will more than likely make you a target, for the Marauders. And so at that point, you know, he says, okay, I have no love for the superhero game, but I can see that things are bad for mutants right now. So, I'll do my part. Where do I sign up? And so he's basically, offering his aid to the team, and also he's offering to, come aboard with the team. And so Storm actually defers to Magneto on this, and Magneto, warns Havok that, there are dark times ahead, not just for mutant kind, but for the world in general. And, we need to, be ready, to face this darkness head on. And so he offers his hand to Havok. And at that point, Havok, he's remembering when, Magneto had initially offered his hand to him at the Hellfire Club, he had straight up refused him. And so now, this time, albeit with some reluctance, he shakes Magneto's hand, accepting the fact that they're in this together, And so then the story ends in New Mexico, with Polaris, having, made short work of the 3 Marauders that had been sent to kill her. And so Sabretooth is, being restrained by makeshift, restraints made up of iron deposits, and Scalp Hunter's being restrained by his own mechanisms, and Arclight is, still, rendered immobile, courtesy of being stuck underground, except with her head being above ground. And so, at that point, it suddenly becomes clear that Polaris isn't herself. And the Marauders, they're like, wait a minute, you're not her. What the hell is going on here? And so that's when she reveals herself and reveals this necklace, a very familiar looking necklace. It's in fact Malice. And she explains that Malice had actually been with Lorna Dane the whole way, while the Marauders had been sent to, basically kind of, spy on her and wait for a chance to take her out, much like they did. But they didn't know that Malice was with them, and she had, gone with Lorna Dane and Alex Summers when they were at the airport. And as soon as Havok got onto the plane, Malice, got inside Lorna. And so even though she didn't possess Lorna Dane right then and there, she got inside of her and started pushing her buttons as soon as, Havok had, left, for New York. And so this whole time, she's been kind of, taking Lorna Dane for a test drive. And so when she was going up against the Marauders by herself, there came a certain point where Malice, decided to go ahead and take control because she wanted to see what this new host could do. And sure enough, Lorna Dane's actually very powerful. It's just she doesn't, often get a chance to exercise her abilities to the fullest extent. And so, with Malice at the helm and no moral compunctions about hurting anyone, getting in her way, much like they were when Lorna Dane was in control, Malice, in Polaris's body, easily defeated these 3 Marauders. And so, they're like, okay, well, what do you plan on doing now? And she says, well, I'm gonna lead you guys now. I'm gonna lead the whole team. And that's how that particular story ends, on a bit of a cliffhanger, because you now have, Malice in a very powerful host body and no moral restraints. And so there we go. So this particular story is kind of a standalone story in a way, and it does hinge on some events that happened before, like especially with the Mutant Massacre, having recently scarred the entirety of the X-Men cast. But you also have, say, enough plot elements from prior storylines that come into play to make it to where, I mean, yes, it's kind of a standalone story, but it also works with what's been going on. Now, granted, there is still the slight little detail about well, what happened with, the whole, discovery of the Brood being in New Mexico? I mean, because the way the last issue ended, Alex Summers, was saying that we need to tell the X-Men. And so he apparently went to New York to do that, but then the X-Men wiped his mind. So, we don't know if, how Alex had, actually succeeded in telling them at that point, or if he got there and he was about to tell them, but then they went ahead and wiped his mind just to, make him less of a target for the Marauders. And so I do think that this issue overall does a really good job of, putting you into a mindset of the character of Havok, and you see him grappling with his own issues and insecurities that he's already been dealing with, but, these nightmares are bringing them, up to the surface once more because, he's in a state of paranoia, because he knows that something's wrong, but he doesn't know what. And so naturally, when you've got your mind playing tricks on you and working against you, anything else that's been a problem is going to come up, and hit you 11 times fold, which is kind of what's happening. And so I will say that it's pretty impressive that, Havok was able to tail Magneto without Magneto detecting him, which, kind of, shows you, I guess, just how well trained, Havok is, as a former member of the X-Men, and in how some of that training kind of is able to easily be tapped into. But also, I liked the idea that, the original X-Men had, been trained by Professor X himself to guard their minds against telepathy or against enemy, telepaths. And so, it's not touched on too often, but, the fact that, he's thinking about it, when he's in the presence of the White Queen, I mean, it's kind of like, that's a nice little detail. And, of course, this is one of those instances where, in real life, like, say, for example, you walk in on a conversation at the wrong time, or you walk in at a very awkward moment in the conversation where it's like, because you didn't hear the full context of the conversation, you end up thinking, something else is going on. And basically, which is what happens when Havok walks in on the X-Men, talking about, making plans to, fake their deaths, because that's what they're talking about. They're not literally talking about, killing themselves. They're talking about faking their deaths so the Marauders, will stop hunting them, but also so they can, preemptively attack the Marauders. And so because Havok walked in on the tail end of that, he literally thought that, some of the X-Men, were in cahoots with Magneto, and Magneto had hoodwinked the rest of them into thinking that he was a good guy. And so now they're wanting to, kill the rest of the X-Men, which is, of course, not what's happening. And so, but because he did walk in, at a rather poorly timed moment, he thinks he hears what he hears and comes to the wrong conclusion, and he just goes all out, with his powers, because he's in full-on paranoid mode, full-on flight or fight mode. But I do like the fact that he gets to a point where he realizes that he's making things worse for everyone, and he's only making even bigger problems by reacting the way he is. And so he has enough self-awareness to stand down, and once he's calmed down enough to listen to reason, and when he joins Magneto's and the rest of the X-Men, he's not doing so because, he has any, love for Magneto or anything like that. In fact, he doesn't really have any great love for the rest of the X-Men, maybe with the exception of Storm, because he doesn't know or trust any of these new X-Men. And he knows some information about them, from what Scott's told him and from some of, the records, but he's never worked with them, so he doesn't trust them very much. But he certainly doesn't trust Magneto. But when they tell him the reality of the situation, he realizes that, if he's going to, since he's already got a stake in this, him being a mutant, he may as well, actively get involved again. but he also realizes that things aren't going to go the way, anyone wants them to. A case in point, he's going to have to work with Magneto now, and the X-Men in turn are going to have to work with the Hellfire Club. But in regards to Lorna Dane, it was fascinating to watch her character, someone who's basically a strong-willed, woman, being put through her paces by, the Marauders. And it was interesting seeing how she's clearly capable of holding her own against them, but it was her own moral compunctions against killing them that, kept her from defeating them. And it wasn't until Malice took over, Malice took over that she was able to actually defeat them, because, well, granted, she wasn't in control, but the point is, she's powerful enough to defeat them on her own. It's just, she needed someone else to be at the wheel, so to speak. And so, sorry. So I did like seeing, even though this turns out to be a scheme by the Marauders, or at least one of the Marauders, to take control of her, I did like seeing the other three put in their place, and like really, given a scrap, because, those three Marauders, especially, were very evil and very sadistic, and they killed a lot of Morlocks. And so it's like, anytime they're putting, some pain, it's kind of like a yes moment, and so it's like, they're evil villains and you want them to get what's coming to them. And so even though this ironically ends up being a scheme by Malice, who herself is a Marauder, the fact is they're still getting, some punishment in a roundabout way. So on the other hand, though, it's not exactly good news for Lorna Dane. And so, because, as we've seen, in prior issues, when Malice gets a hold of you, it doesn't end well. And so now that she's, got a host that she's in full control of, you get the idea that because, she's had some experience with, manipulating the X-Men now, it's a lot easier for her to take full control of Lorna Dane. But also, it should be pointed out that, Lorna, while she was initially in control of herself, she was, reluctant to do what she had to do to defeat them. And it was only when she was at the point of, being grievously injured, in fight or flight mode, which is when Malice was able to take control. And so even though she was with her since the airport, she wasn't in control, didn't take control of her until her life was on the line. And that's when she took her for a test drive, so to speak. So a nice little twist, though, I liked. But it's always interesting in situations like that where you see just how powerful a character is, but because they're not the ones in control of themselves, it makes for something very terrifying in the long run. But I also liked how, Storm and Magneto played off of each other in their interactions with one another, because, initially when Magneto became the leader of the X-Men, per Charles Xavier's, dying wishes, none of the X-Men welcomed him with open arms, but at the same time, they were willing to give him a second chance, because some of them had violent backgrounds and were given second chances by being X-Men. So, and Magneto, kind of got the same treatment in that regard. But I like to seeing how far, their progress has come in terms of, say, respecting each other as not only fellow, X-Men, but also just as people too. And Storm, I think, had started to respect Magneto a little bit more. Prior to him, becoming a leader of the X-Men, once she got to know a little more about him, but at the same time, she still saw him as a threat. But now, while she hasn't forgotten who he used to be, she recognized him for who he's trying to be. And so when she defers to him, it's with, no, paranoia whatsoever. It's like, hey, I can trust this man. And Magneto, of course, he equally values, Storm's input and sees her as a fellow leader as well. And so I liked seeing that mutual respect between them. And of course, I mean, the fact that, he's still haunted by who he used to be, both mentally and socially, is something that I like seeing, it touched on, because in I guess you could say a realistic setting, which when Chris Claremont's writing the book, the X-Men world kind of is in a realistic setting, because you see how people would react to certain situations, or I guess you could say certain fantastical situations. I mean, you still have the fact that even though Magneto is genuinely trying to be a better person and fight for the side of good, I mean, people still recognize him as the villain he used to be. And so, I mean, we see what a frustrating struggle it is for him, but we also understand why people are reluctant to trust him. And it's only the people who have worked with him and have actually seen that he's trying who have been able to, start trusting him again. And so, I like seeing that. And, but yeah, just all in all, though, I thought this was a good issue. And Bret Blevins on doing the guest pencils, I mean, is a very nice touch, especially with the nightmare sequence, because that's when, he gets to go into full-on, horror movie mode, because you see these, monstrous versions of the X-Men, like their faces are elongated and, sharp teeth and everything. And it's pretty scary, and you understand why Havok's as freaked out as he is. But all in all, though, I'm going to go ahead and give this issue 5 out of 5 stars. It was a good story. So I'll show y'all some of the artwork real quick. So, of course, here's the cover. And here he is making his way into the X-Mansion. But, of course, this is a nightmare. And then he finds them, but they're all looking very evil there. And there's Rogue. Now, I like the whole little detail about Rogue and Magneto being the most terrifying looking ones, because he knows that they both used to be villains. But I liked how, they're all just, looking anything but friendly there. And then gradually, Rogue's face just becomes even more monstrous looking. Like she kind of looks like a Joker there. And then just straight up, demonic. And he's waking up there. And here he is letting it all out. And after they've got back inside, there's Lorna, using the kitchen utensils like magnetically to make stuff. And they are headed to the airport. There's, Polaris using her magnetic powers to literally fly the Jeep to the airport. I love this shot, where you see them from the back, the Marauders, Sabretooth, Arclight, and Scalp Hunter. But Sabretooth especially looks, just straight up evil there. And so this is once, Havok's gotten to New York, he's looking around the X-Mansion. He's trying to find out what the heck happened to the X-Men. He finds, Magneto's diary and finds out about the Hellfire Club. And then, of course, comes back here to New Mexico after Lorna Dane's come back from the airport. And Scalp Hunter is getting ready to literally blow her house away. Good detail on Scalp Hunter's gear. And this is sadly, the last, time she'll probably see Havok smiling for a while. And it's only in a photograph. So, first arc light, it causes a shock wave to get Lorna off her feet, and then Scalp Hunter, fires a rocket at the place and blows the whole house up. And then Sabretooth goes after her to confirm the kill. And here's the Hellfire Club, Havok being welcomed in. Sexy French maid servant, leading him to Magneto and White Queen. And there's the White Queen right there. Bret Blevins is pretty good at drawing women when it comes to their faces, I've noticed. So it's Havok and Magneto talking, and White Queen just kind of, watching things. I mean, sort of assisting Magneto, confirming stuff. This is, Havok arguing with them, and Magneto's, trying to tell him, that, hey, if you got a message for the X-Men, I can take it to them, but, they can't contact you right now. And, of course, Havok snaps at them and then leaves, but, one, because he's really frustrated, but also about the whole situation, but also because he's wanting to get out of there before the White Queen starts probing him. This is where Magneto's, cursing, himself, for still not being able to get through to, some of the other, X-Men because of who he used to be. And this is where, Havok, when he finds the Avengers, or where the Avengers mansion used to be. And then, of course, he tries calling Muir Island, but instead of getting Mara McTaggart, he gets Callisto. And, and then when he's asking where his brother is, and she's telling him, look at the yellow pages, you have that nice little moment of irony where his back is turned, but right behind him is a, bus with an X Factor advertisement going by. So, here we got a straight up evil looking Sabretooth, going after Lorna Dane. Some really good horror movie moments here. I love that shot where he's like right above her on the rock. And this is where she tries to fight back against him, but while she is able to do some damage to him, like she's not willing to go all in and kill him, and so which basically allows him to escape and slash her leg up. And then Scalp Hunter fires that energy weapon at her. And here, we got, Havok, who switched into his old uniform, tailing Magneto. And disabling the lock with his power. And then nearly falling to his death, because he didn't take into account that Magneto might have just floated down, once he went through. And there he is finding the Morlock tunnels. Wondering where the hell everyone is and, what happened here, because there's signs of that massive fire. And then he, stumbles upon, Storm, Psylocke, Longshot, and Magneto all talking. And this is where, he comes in on the tail end of their conversation, hearing Storm saying that, the X-Men must die. And he's all like, I love that look of paranoia on his face. I mean, Bret Blevins is just really good at stuff like that, when it comes to psychological horror. And he's like, what the hell's going on here? And then you see, first you see a little bit of a shadow there, and then you see even more right there. So, I mean, he's already freaked out, but when someone comes up on him, blam. And he takes no small pleasure in the fact that it turns out to be Rogue, and him remembering her from the nightmare, he's like, it's on. But then again, he also is wanting to hightail it out of there too, so he doesn't go all in on fighting, but he runs. Then it cuts back to New Mexico, and it's Scalp Hunter and Arclight being bombarded by Polaris's, magnetic powers, basically, turning the desert against them. And then Sabretooth being thrown right at Scalp Hunter. And so while Sabretooth's, briefly incapacitating Scalp Hunter, this is where Polaris uses her powers to cause the Earth to open up and take Arclight in and, sort of entomb her, at least up to her neck, and keep her from moving. And of course, she uses her magnetism to, get all of Scalp Hunter's weapon packs to restrain him. And I love how it goes from one, character using magnetism in one part of the world to another, part of the world where, all in the U.S. of course, but still, it's like this is in New Mexico, or let's see, yeah, that's in New Mexico. This is in New York. So you have Polaris in New Mexico, and then you have Magneto in New York using magnetism to try and restrain Havok. And so it doesn't work out so well. And this is where Dazzler comes in to try and, knock him out. And Havok nearly kills her, but then Longshot, comes to save the day. And there he is, flipping through and then grabbing her. And as Havok himself says, what incredible luck. And that's Longshot's power. Right place, right time. So I like how, even though this story didn't focus on Longshot necessarily, I do like that continuing acknowledgement that, even if characters don't know that good luck is his thing, even they're noticing that guy's lucky. And so I do like that. And then again, Longshot's one of my, favorite characters. So there you go. But I love this shot. So this is when Psylocke is attempting to calm him down, and anytime she gets in contact with someone like telepathically, this little butterfly effect, sort of this butterfly visual effect kind of, is on the scene every time she uses her telepathic powers to reach out to someone. So, a lot of artists who have, drawn this particular effect are like Alan Davis or Mark Silvestri, are really good at it. But Bret Blevins is too as well. So Havok's calmed down to some degree, and they explain a little more about what happened and why they did what they did. And so Havok, this is where he, offers to help them out and join them if they'll have him. And so, this is where Storm, she silently defers to Magneto, and then Magneto just, he reaches out his hand once more and just explains to him that, we're in this together and we're about to go through some dark times. And so, I like that shot though of Magneto. Just, most of his face is in shadow. And you could argue that, that's kind of an acknowledgement of, who he used to be still marking the person that he's now trying to be, So a good man who is no doubt scarred by, his past misdeeds as well as his past in general, but still trying to, put up a good fight. So then, the last page, where all three of those Marauders are being, punished. And then it turns out that it's not Polaris running the show, but it's Malice. You got that necklace, and yeah. And now Polaris has a new look to her, courtesy of Malice. So yeah, that was X-Men issue 219. So it was a good semi-standalone issue. And I like how, it continued, from certain events that happened beforehand, but it's clearly about to lead into some others, but for the most part, it's a good standalone issue, at least in my opinion. The one downside I will say is that we don't know what happened with the Brood, because, like I said, the last issue ended on a bit of a cliffhanger, with Havok telling, Lorna that we need to tell the X-Men about this. And so, they don't say what happened there. All we know is that Havok went to New York, and then at some point the X-Men, tried to, erase his memories, of that particular visit, or at least certain details of that visit to make him less of a target to the Marauders. And so as I've mentioned earlier, we have no way of knowing, at least at this point, we don't know if Havok got around to telling the X-Men about this, or they just tampered with his mind before he could tell them. So that's the one downside. We don't know what happened with the Brood just yet. So I get the feeling that's going to come later. But other than that, though, I thought this was a great story, and Chris Claremont continues to do some good, good writing and character development, especially for Havok, since this is a Havok-centric story. And he even did a good job with Lorna Dane, even though Havok was more the focus of the story. I liked seeing, some of her, some time with her as well. And Bret Blevins, I mean, even though this wasn't a horror story, he did a good job with it in the sense that it had some horror elements to it that, he was able to tap right into. And Dan Green, I thought, did a good job with inking his pencil, so they made a good team. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give issue 219 5 out of 5 stars. It was a good issue. So if you made it this far, thank you very much for coming along this journey. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. And y'all have a good night. Take care. Bye.